A very, very good evening to each and every one of you listening in from wherever you are listening in to this wonderful podcast, the Mogera Black Podcast here in Dubai. Speaking of Dubai, the temperatures just keep rising and rising. The sun is scorching. We had a brief few days, I think around Eid. The weather was nice. It was cool and chill. And it looks like things are just getting back to the usual. Fortunately, for those who have lived here in Dubai for a very long time, they know that this is nothing unusual. Dubai in general is a very beautiful place and it has a lot and plenty to offer. I can't wait to get to the days when the winter is back. Now, if you're coming back to listen to episode 2 of the Greatest of All Time series, I would like to thank you. And if you're just a new visitor to the Greatest of All Time series, please make sure that you listen into the first episode before you come to the second episode, because this might not make a lot of sense for you. This is probably the last book that was written about the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali, rest in peace. And without further ado, I don't want to waste too much of your time because I know that it's precious. So I'm going to just jump into it and welcome back again. I'm your host, Mogera Black, and I hope that you stick around until the rest of the show. And just a little bit of correction, the next chapter of the book was not going to be a brother on a mission, but it was going to be the dawn of a dream. It was late October 1954 when my brother had his bike stolen. The bike, a white and red Shewin, was a Christmas gift and technically meant for both of us. Though in practice, my brother seemed to ride it more often than I did. Back in those days, kids would ride their bikes everywhere, down to the grocery store, also with friends, around the town, searching for adventure in whatever form it might come. On this particular day, Muhammad and I, along with another friend, had heard about a home exhibition show in downtown Louisville taking place on the 4th Street, and we were eager to check it out. We left our bikes beside a rail next to the building, assuming they would be safe, and then sauntered inside in anticipation of making the most out of the afternoon. And sure, it was a fine afternoon, and fancy automobiles on display. Bands entertained the folk there, having a day out with their families in a lively atmosphere. After spending near enough 3 hours milling around, we decided that it was time to head back home. Timekeeping, as I've mentioned, was a priority in our household. We walked back to get our bikes, but when we got there, they had vanished, stolen. Shocked and extremely upset, my brother started to cry. This bike had been given to him by our parents as a Christmas present, but more than anything, Muhammad concerned would be getting a good hiding from our dad when he learned of our negligence. Other people were coming out of the building, and so, both gulping tears back, we asked one guy where we could find a policeman. One man directed us to a building within the vicinity of the show, and so we made our way there to report our stolen bikes. As we entered the basement there, with tears still on our eyes, the first sounds we heard were thirds and groans. The swap, swap, swap of skipping ropes hitting the floor, and sounds of gloved fists hitting heavy bags. There were about half a dozen men and older boys doing boxing drills in the basement, which clearly wasn't a police station, but a gymnasium. Though sure enough, across the room, we spotted a middle-aged man in a police uniform. His name was Joe Martin. He was meticulously guiding some boys through the finer points of forming the correct boxing stance as we walked up to him. Muhammad, collecting himself, said, "Mister, we were upstairs at the home show, and when we went outside to ride our bikes home, someone had stolen them. Can you help us get our bikes back?" Martin, who seemed like a gentleman, proceeded to take the description of the stolen bikes and told us he would put in a report, but he wasn't going to let us go without making a sales speech of his own. "By the way," he said, almost offhandedly after he was done with the official side of matters, "why don't you two little boys come back tomorrow, say around 6 o'clock in the evening, to this gym, so you can learn how to box?" Muhammad, who still had the traces of his tears in his cheeks, got that familiar challenging glint in his eyes, and told this big policeman that was going to beat up the culprit as soon as he got a grip of him. Martin, who we would grow to learn he was a patient man, listened to a whole barrage of the threats before suggesting to my brother that first he would have to learn to fight, and in particular, box before he should even entertain this thought, let alone resort to this illegal tactic. We had limited knowledge of boxing and had never seriously contemplated taking up the sport, but as it turned out, Muhammad was so enraptured by the sights, the smell, and the vibe in the gym that he almost forgot about his bike. Martin finished writing the report and reiterated the gym's opening hours, handing Muhammad an application to take home with him. Still worried about his bike, but thrilled at the prospect of giving his new sport a shot, my brother happily took the piece of paper. Muhammad never did get his bike. Perhaps surprisingly though, our parents were understanding when we revealed what had happened, with our father nonchalant in the face of negligence. My brother meanwhile remained set on boxing for long enough to join Martin's gym, and I, of course, followed along with him. Now, what most people are oblivious to is that one of our young cousins was a boxer. He was dabbling in boxing well before we entered the gym. Even before Martin's offer, he had enthusiastically offered to train Muhammad and teach him, knowing my brother's prosperity for getting into scraps and wanting him to be able to defend himself in case he ever got into an altercation with other kids. And it was our cousin who initially accompanied us to the gym and kept our interests when we otherwise might have been distracted by other childish things. As much as he was impelled to involve Muhammad in boxing, our cousin wasn't very successful and eventually quit. However, we brothers kept our training. I can recall Muhammad's first day at the gym with some clarity. He threw himself into the deep and almost immediately getting into the ring with an older boy, thinking he could hold his own without any real experience. It took no more than 60 seconds though for my brother to realize that throwing wild punches wasn't going to get him anywhere. Muhammad wasn't trying ever so hard to knock the guy out. His training partner, Spurrier's experience and punching power left him dazed and bleeding from the nose. Martin, though, appreciated my brother's enthusiasm. This fast-failed foray into the sweet science showed my brother's zeal and his heart. Martin's gym, the Columbia gym, was integrated with black and white boxers training under the same roof, despite the racial tensions in Louisville at the time. The sport brought both colors together in a way that not many other venues could. In the basement, every fighter was treated the same and spared together without prejudice. While training at Martin's gym though, a black boxing coach by the name of Fred Stoner caught Muhammad's attention. Stoner had a gym on the other side of town, which pretty much catered for nothing but black boxers. Even though Muhammad's loyalty was to Martin, when Muhammad and I went to our first tournament, we were very impressed by how Stoner's boxers dressed. Their boots and shorts matched their robes, and they generally seemed well taken care of. Still, he didn't want to put a dent in his relationship with Martin. And so eventually, Muhammad found a way to work with both while each remained oblivious to the other's influence. I, of course, followed my brother, something I was rather well practiced at the time. I let my brother lead and stuck to him like a magnet. We would train at Martin's gym in the early evenings, and then later we would head to Stoner's dungeon for more physical and mental torture. It was worth the investment though. Every trainer had their quirks, and being exposed to more styles and tricks certainly helped our growth in those early days. The strength and size I had and Muhammad's fast developing skills elevated us quickly in the ranks of both gyms. We both trained hard, but I have to admit I was a little bit more lackluster in regard to self-discipline compared to my brother. Boxing became Muhammad's life. He raced the bus to school and soared off soda pop in pursuit of greatness. I went along with it because he was my brother and I hung out with him, but his passion exceeded mine. He really wanted to reach the top and was willing to sacrifice to get there. He devoured boxing, falling in love with the sweet science and bragging to me about how he was going to be the greatest ever, in turn to change our family status. It was there from the start. Muhammad, who was always aware of our family's struggles with money, had his ambition to become famous from the outset of his career. Later in life, his early dreams about how much money he would accrue came to seem ironic. When he did get rich, after all, he didn't particularly care of his wealth, and he gave it away as if someone found it distasteful. Still, at the same time, it was a big part of my brother's motivation. Then again, what teenager wouldn't be motivated to become a sports champion, famous, and have all the money in the world. I was more motivated by money and fame than pursuit of perfection, for sure. It didn't take long before we began to compete regularly. At school, kids knew we boxed because they saw us on the local TV show Tomorrow's Champions, which was broadcasting amateur bouts. We would earn $4 for each bout, most of them organized by Joe Martin. Apparently, our amateur boxing careers were also being followed by the locals, and after just a few bouts, we became minor celebrities in our little world, in the black community in particular. More surprisingly, the white kids that we had contact with also now had more of an amiable attitude towards Muhammad and I, because they knew we were so popular. If you were white and prejudiced and you were a kid, you were kind of still impressed when you heard or read about Muhammad or saw him fight. Hey, I saw your boxing match on TV last night, kids would say to him on the street, the same kids who a year or two earlier wouldn't have even looked in our direction. It gave my brother a taste of fame early on, before it was even considered for representing his country in the Olympics, which eventually would propel him to fame, which went way beyond our local circle. Schools were segregated in Louisville, like any other state in the South. Grade school all the way up through high school. Muhammad and I graduated from an all-black school. Everyone was just about the same, in that they came from humble beginnings. A lot of young boys and girls that we grew up around had government support for their lunches at school, and no one had much in terms of material possession. This segregation and poverty quickly taught us that being black meant you were different. But pretty early in life, my brother and I also came to the realization that it was grossly unfair. We would switch on the TV and come across some horrific stories. Dogs set on black people and lynchings, accompanied by images that would stay embedded in our heads forever. As two young black men, Muhammad and I thought to ourselves, why are blacks treated differently here in America? In our early lives, of course, we could do nothing about it, but I believe that even back then, Muhammad was planning to help the world. Schooling, on the other hand, wasn't something that Muhammad took seriously. He was the class clown, he was far from being the sharpest student in the first place, and he didn't even put much effort in his education, even before boxing. Education wasn't something he cautiously thought to be of great significance or value. And when he got introduced to boxing when he was in middle school, he more or less gave boxing precedence over schooling. Muhammad had to stay somewhat motivated to make sure he didn't flunk. But since the chances of him becoming a success through schooling alone seemed slim, he dedicated his efforts elsewhere. He wasn't the only one. If there was any one single person who was driving force behind my brother, it was our father. Our mother was happy to go along with it, but Cash Clay had his foot on the gas. Neither of our parents had really a stable job, and when we both showed some promise in boxing, our father saw it as the family's meal ticket. Not just out of poverty. Our father had the notion that both of his sons, no less, were going to be world champions. He had great faith in us. Father took interest with intense earnestness and would be sitting ringside at all our fights. He was a proud dad. Actually, he was one of the biggest fans, and it's worth repeating, Dad thought both of us were going to hit it big, not just Muhammad. I don't think even my brother would tell you exactly how many bouts he notched up under Joe Martin's tutelage from the ages of 12 to 18. I know he fought often, more than once a month, with me often alongside him, and barely took a break. Even in the early fight, you could see hints of greatness he would develop later as he learned to circle and evade punches, pulling straight away from the opponent's swipes in a way that made some traditionalists wince. He notched up 6 Kentucky Golden Glove titles in 2 national championships in what had to be over 100 amateur bouts, of which he only lost 8. In 1960, he entered the Golden Gloves as a light heavyweight to avoid the chance that he would meet during the tournament, and won the tournament handedly. Later the same year, he traveled to San Francisco to try out for the sport with the national team and saw off a handful of outclassed opponents before winning a tough bout against Allen Hudson to secure a place on the team for the Olympics set to be held in Rome. I didn't get to go to Rome, of course. My parents and I watched my brother battle on TV. In the early bouts, he looked like the world beater we knew he was, easily outmatching opponents who seemed to have never seen a heavyweight so able to move, dodge, and dance before. The finals we knew would be tougher, as he was facing an opponent of great pedigree. On the 5th of September, he stepped into the ring against Zygzy Petrzykowski of Poland. Both fighters weighed in at 178 pounds. The Polish boxer was a tough southpaw fighter who was 7 years older than my brother and had much more experience on his side. Nevertheless, Muhammad triumphed by beating him via a unanimous decision to clinch the gold medal in the light heavyweight division. This was a dream manifesting into reality, a day I'll never forget. Upon his arrival to Louisville, a large hometown crowd eagerly awaited his arrival at the airport. My parents and I, the mayor of Louisville, the city aldermen, some local ministers and students from the Central High School, along with the participants and the teachers, had all made an effort to be at the airport to greet him. Numerous photographers from the local newspapers were waiting to snap a picture of the new champion. My brother, our parents and I were escorted from the airport by a motorcade through the streets of Louisville en route to Central High School. Students and members of the public were milling around outside the school, holding the banners, "Welcome home Cassius Marcellus Jr., Olympic light heavyweight champion." As our car approached the school, students and well-wishers rushed to see their own Louisville native, and Muhammad was happily taking it all in. We followed Muhammad to the school auditorium, where 2 seats on stage awaited my parents. My humble family knew that this would be the momentous moment, but it was even bigger than we could ever have imagined. As everyone settled down, Mr. Alwood S. Wilson was the first to speak. He shared with the audience how extremely proud he, the faculty, and the students were of a former student bringing home the gold medal. After his heartfelt speech, he beckoned Muhammad to come forward to speak and share his experiences at the Olympics. The audience stood up and gave him a standing ovation. That went on for a few minutes. Muhammad rose from his seat and began speaking to the crowd. He spoke eloquently about the Polish opponent, a man who he had unbeaten had given him a tough fight, pummeling him with heavy shots. My brother, though, was not too humble to note that he had been too quick and too clever for his adversary, and attributed his victory to the determination and boxing skills that he had spent years practicing. He told us how proud he was to bring the medal back to America. He spoke of how he had dreamed that someday he would not only make it to the Olympics but triumph, and that now that he had achieved his dream, he would use the Olympics podium as a platform to make his voice heard. The Olympics, he told the assembled crowd, would be the golden key to unlock many truths, a phrase that bemused many in the crowd who weren't aware of my brother's newfound interest in the politics of race in America. After Muhammad finished addressing the crowd, everyone in the audience once again stood up and gave him another standing ovation. The exuberant students asked if they could see and touch the medal. Getting a glimpse of it was not enough. Everyone wanted to get their hands on the gold. Muhammad graciously stepped down on stage, stood there with a smile all across his face as each student walked up on him and touched the fruits of his labor. After an eventful time at the school, Muhammad was escorted out of the auditorium and we drove through downtown to our house. There were flashing lights and sirens as the motorcade passed through the Louisville en route to our humble home. I was savoring the moment in the front passenger seat, while Muhammad sat and stood in the back, waving with a signature smirk on his face at all the onlookers. When we arrived outside our home on the Grand Avenue, all our neighbors were milling around to give the new champ a hero's reception. The local newspaper was there to grab an interview and snap pictures. I remember gazing at the medal and how beautiful it looked hanging around his neck, and he spoke to all of those present. Eventually, the crowd disappeared. Thrilled to have been in the presence of the Olympic hero, I began to reflect back on the years of us training together, running together in the early hours in the morning, and discussing the best amateur boxers. Muhammad would always tell me with great conviction, "Rudy, one day I'll win the Olympic light heavyweight gold medal." I had faith in my brother's boxing ability, so I didn't for one moment let pessimistic sentiments overshadow the optimism. But still, there's no better feeling in this world than to witness the success of a family member. Our parents had always told us that we had to be dedicated to boxing in order to become successful. Our dad would explain that we would encounter obstacles along the way to success. Some parents aren't supportive of their kids, but ours encouraged us, and that's something I'll always. Of course, my brother's life changed from that moment, but mine changed. I was sort of a celebrity in high school because my brother's newfound status. The students would smile and wish me well as I passed by them in the hallways or sat with them in the classroom. It was my senior year in Central High School, and I'll never forget it. Now, for more than 5 decades, everyone has known that Muhammad threw his gold medal away in the Ohio River because he wasn't allowed to eat in a restaurant in our hometown after he won the Olympics. But I read somewhere that this is false, fabricated story, concocted by someone unknown to me and my brother and widely accepted. They said that my brother lost his medal and I did everything in my power to help to try and find it. They claimed that we looked everywhere in the house without any luck. As you can imagine, it was a symbol of prestige and something my brother was very proud of. Unfortunately, years later, someone for whatever reason decided to spread that bullshit. I can put the record straight here. Muhammad and I went to the restaurant together when we were refused service. Muhammad said, "I would like a cheeseburger." The lady replied, "We don't serve niggers." My brother sarcastically said, "I don't eat them either. Just give me a cheeseburger." Realizing we weren't going to get served, we left disgusted and angry, and when we got to the 2nd Street Bridge, my brother tossed his beloved medal in the river. I tried stopping him, but my brother said, "No, Rocky, I'm hurt. I have been disrespected. It hurts me bad." Next thing you know, I actually started to cry. That was the last time we both laid our eyes on the Olympic medal, so I witnessed it with my own eye. After the Olympics, Muhammad turned professional and signed up with the Louisville Group, a group of 10 millionaires who became his management team. They had approached my brother after his victory in Rome, offering to cover his training expenses, travel, housing, and food, as well as paying him a signing bonus and guaranteed income in return for 50% of the income from his fights and future activities. It also meant saying goodbye to Joe Martin, who I would like to say on the record had guided Muhammad really well and had cultivated a great relationship with both of us during the course of their trainer-fighter relationship. Muhammad's professional debut was on the 29th of October 1960 against Tony Hansaka, a bout which took place in Louisville Freedom Hall. After that fight, a 6-round affair which my brother won on points, Muhammad's management team decided to employ the services of boxing widely respected coach Angelo Dundee. This meant that Muhammad would have to relocate to Miami Beach, where Angelo ran the famous 5th Street Gym. Interestingly, my brother's first ever encounter with Angelo, however, had come years before, in our hometown in 1958. Angelo was training light heavyweight champion Willie Pastrano, who was in town for the fight with George Holman. My brother followed the sport very closely and would never pass up a chance to meet a fighter or trainer he respected. And so after the fight, which Pastrano lost, he called Angelo's room from the hotel lobby, asking if he could see him and his fighter for 5 minutes. After a long pause, Angelo agreed, and so Muhammad and I went to their room to meet him and his dejected fighter. Well, Muhammad more or less barged in there and backed at Angelo to take him on as a boxer. Dundee and his fighter were watching TV and drinking orange juice and eating potato chips when we interrupted. Pastrano, who was lying in bed in his undervest indulging in a bowl of ice cream, initially dismissed my brother. He thought Muhammad was just this young enthusiastic teenager with a big mouth, and Muhammad, never reticent about getting his views across, immediately started bragging to Angelo that he was going to be the next heavyweight champion of the world. On one hand, Angelo was taken aback by that kind of boastfulness because it wasn't something no athlete resorted to back then. On the other hand, he was kind of a man who saw this sort of confidence as a positive in a fighter, a necessary quality for success in a tough sport. 5 minutes turned into 3.5 hour conversation, consisting mostly of Muhammad peppering the coach and his fighter with questions. Muhammad was very inquisitive in his enthusiasm and evident to Angelo, and I think he was able to ascertain that this young man was something special. Anyway, after my brother won the Olympic gold, Angelo happened to run into him in Louisville. Angelo was more receptive this time, telling him to join him in Miami. Much as it was a tempting offer at the time, Muhammad declined it. Why? I don't know. When the Louisville group hired the coach to train their new golden goose, it was an ideal move for Muhammad that would be a start of a new beginning. Before Muhammad made the transition, he had been training with Jesse Joe Walcott, who had him moping and sweeping the floor. Muhammad didn't like it there. In fact, he hated it. He had voiced his concerns to Jesse Joe to no avail, clearly stating that he wasn't there to wash dishes and do chores, but to train. This fell on deaf ears. So when my brother called Angelo, he wanted nothing more than to make a quick exit. Angelo was kind of expecting the call and all for it, and Muhammad desperate told him, "I'd like to work out tomorrow." "Where are you?" asked Angelo. "I'm in Louisville." Angelo asked. "Well, how are you going to get here?" Muhammad replied, "I'm going to drive there." So he drove all the way to Miami, which was a 15-hour drive, long, exhausting, but in his eyes, well worth the trip. The next day, Sunday morning, Muhammad made his way to the famed 5th Street gym. Angelo's young son Jimmy would go to the gym with his father on Sunday. When the dandies arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning, they saw Muhammad patiently sitting on the stairs waiting for them. Muhammad swiftly made an impression on a young Jimmy. They all walked upstairs and into the gym so Angelo could show my brother the modest training facility. Muhammad caught Angelo off guard when he remarked that he wanted to have a sparring session and fight on Tuesday, 2 days after his marathon drive. Angelo's brother Chris, who was a promoter, would be in charge of setting up this fight. Muhammad, of course, was keen to make up for lost time. Angelo paired him with Willie Patrano and a handful of other heavyweights, and they sparred in a session that would go down as everyone's memory as another example of my brother's early brilliance. To be perfectly frank, my brother pretty much kicked the tar out of Willie and Angelo's other young heavyweight. He was nothing short of superb in the ring. Impressed with Muhammad's extraordinary performance, the coach turned to his star pupil, Willie, who was the light heavyweight champion of the world, mind you, and said, "You had a bad day. You might as well go home. You're tired." Muhammad was desperate to show his new coach his pedigree. He would normally take it easy on people he trained with, but he was all pumped up, wanting to prove a point, and didn't hold back on those guys at all. He gave them a very hard time, and his new coach for his part realized this was, as he referred to my brother, the best kid. This wasn't the end of my brother's introduction to my. However, after the first workout, Muhammad, along with Angelo and Jimmy, got together with some friends of Angelo to have lunch at a place downtown. Angelo, of course, eagerly wanted to introduce his new Olympic champion to his friends. As the three entered an eatery near the gym, though, the man at the counter met Muhammad smile with a glare and said, "We don't serve Negroes here." Well, he followed up with something worse than that, derogatory remarks that didn't go down well with my brother. It was as if an alien had walked in. Muhammad would have been within his rights to want to teach this man some manners, but at this moment, Angelo entered. "We're not having any of those," he said, looking the man right in the eye. "We're having hamburger. We are sitting here and we're having lunch." At this point, there was nothing this guy could do. It was in his best interest to break the rules and keep his mouth shut. Anyway, after this little mishap, they all sat down and had lunch, and Muhammad's trainer introduced him to several of his friends. Due to the segregation laws, finding a place for Muhammad to stay became problematic. Muhammad initially stayed at the Mary Elizabeth and Sir John hotels in Overtown, a whites-only zone, before his coach found him a place. Angelo was concerned about his well-being, and he had every reason to be, just because just being in those areas was enough to attract unwelcome attention, and my brother wasn't one to keep a low profile. Eventually, Angelo locked down a place for him on the 7th Avenue at 118th Street, which was right down from the street where Angelo lived, a grey one-floor home with a front and a back, not exactly an Olympic champion's quarters. And even then, his troubles with rest didn't end. Muhammad, when he ran to the gym as part of his daily exercise, would periodically get stopped by the police. Angelo would get phone calls from the police almost daily, always variations on the theme they didn't believe my brother was at the fabled 5th Street gym, and were adamant on checking out his story. "Angelo, is this young man your fighter?" the policeman would ask. "Yes, he's my fighter," Angelo would tell them. Often irritated, "Please let him go and train." Miami wasn't necessarily better than any other place in the United States surrounding prejudice, but thank goodness my brother was at least staying within the vicinity of Angelo's home. As the fighter-trainer relationship started to gel, Muhammad would spend every holiday together with Dundee's family. I was in senior high school when my brother signed his contract with Louisville Group and left for Miami. After turning professional, he spent a large amount of money he received from his sponsoring group to purchase our parents a new home. Mom had often spoken about some of the things she desired to have, a new home being one. I can vividly recall how happy our mother was. Now our family could afford some luxuries as my brother's future looked bright. It wasn't long before I got the call to follow Muhammad. Despite his close bond with Dundee family, my brother didn't trust a lot of the folks at the time, and consequently, in 1962 he sent for me because he wanted a close family member with him. For my part, I never really had a regular job, so I jumped at the chance. My job was to be a member of Muhammad's entourage and training camp. Needless to say, I wasted no time packing my bags and moved out there to be with him. I quickly settled in with my brother. Muhammad and I would often spend time watching movies in our front room and relaxing. We both would usually go to bed at 11 p.m. because we had to wake up early in the morning to our road work. Quite apart from his patience in dealing with police officers, Angelo was just what my brother needed. He was a wonderful character, combining the warmth you would associate with a favorite uncle and a mastery of fighters' psychology. He could get into his fighters' head and urge them to accomplish things without them even knowing he tried, which at the point of my brother's career was exactly what he needed. Early on, Muhammad was very stubborn, and so the game became for Angelo to find some way to convince his fighter that whatever he wanted to do was his own idea. He spent a lot of time kind of manipulating Muhammad, getting him to think that he was the one deciding to train more, train less, work specific punch or whatever. If he wanted my brother to throw an uppercut more, he would heap praise on him for the one time in a round he threw it, and the next round Muhammad might throw it half a dozen times. One of my favorite anecdotes concerning Angelo comes from a different fighter that he was training at the time. The guy's confidence in his punching was ebbing, specifically his confidence about hitting with power. That kind of worry, as my fighter knows, can be death. If you aren't convinced that you can hit, you'll be afraid to tread, and you'll be the only one to get hurt. So one day before the training session, Angelo unscrewed the top of the peanut bag, and the first time the boxer hit the bag, it came right off his moorings and flew across the gym, and it was knocked off. The stunned fighter suddenly thought he had his explosive punching power and started hitting with confidence. Imagine having a guy like that on helping you out behind the scenes. We would occasionally fight between ourselves. Sometimes he would whoop me, and other times I would whip him, but I could feel him becoming better, faster and stronger. It was two-way traffic, of course. Every boxer works hard, but Angelo has said that he never had a boxer who worked that hard. This was a man, mind you, who in his career coached more than 15 world champions. In fact, Angelo felt Muhammad worked too hard sometimes. It was very clear, even early in his career, that Muhammad took too many punches in training. Angelo knew, as did I, that he allowed his sparring partners to hit him in the head. Even after donning a headguard, he would welcome the sort of severe punishment that most boxers would do everything in their power to evade. He was convinced that being pummeled would toughen him up for real fights, which in those days didn't sound as crazy as it does today. Any way you look at it, my brother was a consummate professional. He was convinced that being pummeled would toughen him up for real fights, which in those days didn't sound as crazy as it does today. Any way you look at it, my brother was a consummate professional who worked hard and did everything he could to prepare for each and every one of his fights, and of course, his toughest fights were yet to come. Thank you very much for those of you who have tuned in, or those of you who have been listening in from the very first minutes to the very last, and I appreciate that, investing your time in this work that we do. And don't forget to support us as much as you can. Share our work, like and support and subscribe. For those of you who might be interested to listen to the next episode, it will be out next week. And from me, Mugera Black, I would like to say I'm out.